You know, if you've ever tried reading the very first chapter of the New Testament, you probably hit an absolute wall of names, right? It's just so-and-so fathered so-and-so, over and over. Honestly, it feels a lot like reading a dry ancient census. But in this explainer, we're going to dive into the brilliant, kind of hidden theology of the ancient world's most surprising genealogical record, the 5 women of Matthew. We're going to look at how one writer literally rewrote the rules of history telling to make a really profound point about exactly who belongs. Okay, so let's dive into this mystery by asking a pretty foundational question. Why on earth would Matthew intentionally shatter the strict rules of ancient record-keeping right in the opening lines of his text? I mean, in the ancient Near East, genealogies were absolutely crucial. They weren't just simple lists, they were legally binding documents that established your covenantal continuity and your community identity. They proved your legal standing. And yet Matthew does something here that would have immediately shocked a first-century reader. To understand why, we really have to look at the exact words he uses to open his account. Section 1. A Disruptive Royal Genealogy. Subtitle: The Biblos Geneseos. So Matthew 1 isn't just a boring civic census. It actually kicks off with the Greek phrase Biblos Geneseos, which signals a brand new creation account. And here is the massive anomaly. While standard ancient lists were almost universally male-dominated, basically treating women as legally invisible for royal lineage, Matthew's list is deliberately interrupted by 5 women. And make no mistake, this isn't just archival clumsiness. It's actually a theological confession, showing a progressively unfolding divine purpose. Section 2. Breaching the patrilineal rules. The 5 exceptional women. Now, if you're going to break the strict rules of ancient genealogy, you better have a really good reason. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, referred to here as the wife of Uriah, and, finally, Mary. Inserting these 5 specific names was a highly calculated act meant to completely jar the ancient reader. It forces anyone paying attention to stop in their tracks and ask, wait, what do these outsiders have in common? Why highlight them of all people in the royal line of King David? Section 3. Solving the Genealogical Mystery. The 4 Historical Hypotheses. Historians have literally pored over this text for centuries. And to figure out Matthew's exact motive, we have to kind of play detective and eliminate the less likely theories. For example, the sinner's reading assumes these women are just highlighted as examples of grace to the unworthy. But that completely falls apart when you realize Ruth is explicitly praised as a woman of noble character, and Judah even confesses that Tamar is more righteous than he is. Then there's the irregular unions theory. Sure, it prepares us for Mary, but it doesn't explain why these specific 4 women were chosen out of all the irregular unions in Israel's long history. And the Queen Mother's hypothesis notes that court records often listed a king's mother. But Matthew doesn't just name them, he actively interprets their stories. So by process of elimination, we land on what is definitely the most comprehensive solution, the Gentile inclusion hypothesis. Matthew is purposefully writing the nations directly into King David's line. He's showing us that the grand promise to bless all the families of the earth wasn't an afterthought. It was always part of the plan, woven right into the Messiah's very own ancestry. And this table just brilliantly illustrates the answer. Every single one of these 4 Old Testament women was either a Gentile herself or deeply bound to a Gentile household. Ancient writers like Philo identified Tamar as a woman from Syria-Palestine. Rahab is, of course, famously Canaanite. Ruth is a Moabite. And Bathsheba is specifically referred to as the wife of Uriah, firmly tying her to a Hittite household. Matthew is proving, without a doubt, that the blessing of the nations was always right there in the Messiah's DNA. Section 4. Defending Mary with History. Subtitle: A Grammatical Apology. Now, in the late 1st century, the unique conception of Jesus was a point of really severe controversy and slander. So Matthew is effectively making this historical argument to his critics. If you're going to dismiss Jesus because of the cultural irregularities surrounding his mother, well, then you also have to dismiss the irregularities God already superintended in your absolute greatest kings, Judah and David. He's showing that God has literally always worked his promise plan through culturally irregular circumstances. It's a real game changer of an argument. And this is where Matthew's genius absolutely shines. For 39 straight generations, he uses the active Greek verb egnesin, which basically means fathered, marking ordinary biological descent. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, boom, boom, boom. But then, in verse 16, the pattern suddenly snaps. He shifts to hes egenethe, meaning from whom was born.
and he uses a feminine singular pronoun pointing exclusively to Mary. It is a brilliant legal maneuver, definitively showing that while Joseph was the legal father, securing Jesus' place in the house of David, Mary was the sole physical origin.
Section 5. The Ultimate Promise Plan. Fulfilling the Abrahamic Goal. Let's kind of zoom out for a second to the macro view of what theologian Walter C. Kaiser Jr. calls the promise plan of God. Matthew actually structures this history into 3 distinct epochs of 14 generations. Now, some scholars think the number 14 is a Hebrew code for David's name, but even more importantly, it's a carefully curated timeline counting distinct eras. Epoch 1 moves from Abraham to David, securing that royal promise. Epoch 2 moves to the Babylonian deportation, a really dark time of judgment and failure. And Epoch 3 moves from that exile to the Christ. Matthew is making a massive claim here. Jesus isn't just another descendant, he is the eschatological climax who brings about the true end of the exile. Which brings us to a really beautiful, non-supersessionist reality. Okay, I know that's a big word, but it basically just means this. The inclusion of Gentiles, those 4 women in the genealogy, and the later mission to the nations isn't some late backup plan that replaces Israel. Not at all. It is the exact fulfillment of the original promise made to Abraham, that through his seed all nations would be blessed. As the Apostle Paul would later describe, the wild branches of the nations are grafted into a cultivated root, whose calling remains absolutely irrevocable. The particular serves the universal. So, what's the takeaway from this explainer? The pastoral yield here is just incredibly powerful. When we look at Matthew's evidence, we clearly see that the promise plan advances through irregular households, ethnically mixed backgrounds, morally compromised histories, and unlikely outsiders being grafted in. The exact same God who wrote unlikely outsiders into King David's line continues to write unlikely disciples into his restored community today. He didn't sanitize his own history, He redeemed it. The whole shebang.
I really want to leave you with this thought to ponder. We so often think of ancient religious texts as requiring perfection to enter. But Matthew's genealogy proves the exact opposite. If the very genesis of this story intentionally shatters the rules to welcome the irregular, the broken, and the outsider, how does that change the way you see your own place in it? Thank you so much for exploring the brilliant theology of Matthew's 5 women with me today. Keep asking great questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.